I absolutely love the Power Windows album from Rush. This is the ultimate 1980s, stuck in your room in suburbia, United States, or North America rather, let's include Canada obviously, and just wishing for an escape. There's the lyrical content of this song. The album art probably helps, but the album art was probably inspired by the lyrical content. It seems like a visualization of the track Middletown Dreams. But even then, it's a just a grand rock observation concept album of the mid 1980s. The big money, grand designs, territories, marathon, and and Manhattan Project, Mystic Rhythms, Emotion Detector. These these are so manifest. These are so indicative of one particular decade. The threat of nuclear annihilation, the growing superficiality of relationships as it's perceived to be after the sexual revolution, and then the 60s and 70s flower power, and now we're in this kind of do what thou wilt era of the boomers lifestyle in the 1980s, Reaganomics, finance, greed, corporations. This is the on the mind of Neil Peart all throughout Power Windows lyrics. The ultimate art rock album of the 1980s in some respects, in that all of its sonics would have been considered totally tasteless and disgusting in any other era, certainly. By the 2010s or 2020s, to replicate this album would be to homage the 1980s too much and to be too unoriginal, although this is perfectly poised as an artifact of its year of release, 85. I consider it one of the most enjoyable studio albums within the Rush discography, an album which features all of the pop sensations of a typical 1980s, recording, and yet it also contains these art rock flourishes. This involving, it makes you want to listen to it and hang on to every melody, note, word. It's highly re-listenable rather than being kind of disposable pop throwaway. Every song sounds the same. It's just an interesting experiment, and the band invites you to listen intently to both the music and the lyrics, and to treat it as though it's a considered kind of a novel experience, as the the more artistic pretensions of the album are still in vogue in Rush, despite many other bands issuing this in favor of entirely pop hooks and a prospective single for every other track. Rather, this is an album of, while there was single potential here, there were videos associated with some of the songs in this album. Every track on here is like 5 minutes minimum. It's meant for dedicated listeners more than anyone else. As much as Rush were trying to involve themselves in the sonics of that zeitgeist, I think they were also trying to lend an ear to the fans who found their music involving and interesting rather than danceable. They still wanted to evoke what made their albums interesting in the 1970s, and I think they did so. Absolutely. I was not around at the time, although looking back in retrospect, I consider Power Windows, as I said, one of the most interesting Rush albums ever. So let's go through this track list and see if we cannot explain why I personally feel this way. Shall we? Track list goes as such. The Big Money is quite terrific, I think. Grand Designs is a tremendous Rush song. It has been pointed out before that Geddy Lee singing a few times toward the end there is annoying. I agree. Manhattan Project is amazing, one of the best Rush songs, as is Marathon, and I think Territories is stellar also. The only flaws with this album's sequencing are the next 2/3 tracks. Well, Middletown Dreams is, aside from being a bit corny, though well-intentioned and nice sentiment about it, it's not the most interesting song compositionally. Emotion Detector is more interesting compositionally, although maybe repeats itself just a bit too much. Mystic Rhythms is interesting, although it doesn't have the most exciting tempo without being extraordinarily atmospheric either. You don't quite sink into the track because it just it bounces and screams out at you so much that it doesn't kind of involve. I mean, you're hanging on the edge of your seat more than you're being absorbed into this sort of track. And for a slower tempo track, take some of the tracks on the next album, they involve you, and they draw you in because the melodies are kind of soft, and you sink into them easier on Hold Your Fire compared to some of the last track on Power Windows. But it's quite an impressive album. I've heard Rush in the 80s derided before as becoming the Police, and I hear that, but on Power Windows certainly it sounds like they're upstaging the Police and showing them what's what. Not in terms of creating kind of pandering, pop hooky, boy band, power poppy sort of, appropriating Caribbean and Jamaican music sort of nonsense. I'm not the biggest fan of the Police's. The first 3 albums I don't really care for that reason. I love Ghost in the Machine for the Hugh Padgham production and all that, but Synchronicity I don't care for. It's just too much of a stab at a great album, and I see through it. But Rush on Power Windows take that power trio format, and they turn it into this phenomenal big music sensation. The keys, the guitar, the drums, the bass, all loud and defined. Awesome. What distinguishes the sound on Power Windows compared to Rush albums of the 1970s or progressive rock albums of the 1970s in general is that there's no layer of sound, there's no soundscape beneath the 4 main instruments and the vocals, guitar, bass, keys, drums. There's no layer of sound beneath it. It's all just the power trio attack, much like the punk/new wave era was bringing about, the back to basics as opposed to the, if there's a sheen of a landscape with even Led Zeppelin and The Who at times, or a time and a place, versus just the instruments in a studio feel of the punk/new wave era, which Rush is certainly catching up to and doing a spectacular, bombastic job with on the Power Windows record. It's a very big sound, largely driven by the bass guitar, and then these great key stabs, the powerful drumming hooking you in, and Alex Lifeson's guitar solo kind of chimes in and out during these segments, and they usually give room for him to unleash a very powerful, monstrous solo. I think Alex Lifeson really shines on this album as a soloist rather than as the riff maker or as the hook maker. The hook, I don't know, whatever you would say. Geddy and Neil operate more as this than Alex here. Alex is more of the soloist, instrumentalist. From that big sound on The Big Money, continuing through the grand designs, I think Manhattan Project is extraordinary and traces the themes of the album back to 1945. Marathon takes on the kind of adrenaline, kind of contemporary first world phenomenon of marathon running, long distance running, as Iron Maiden did the next year in the Loneliness of a Long Distance Runner. Well, that was also a homage to a great British film by Tony Richardson from 1962. Worth mentioning that, obviously. And then Territories, excellent piece on geopolitics and the Cold War. Emotion Detector is Middletown Dreams. It's about the prospective audiences, the listeners of Power Windows. And then, of course, Emotion Detector, this somewhat, I was going to say typical love song, given that this is the 1980s, and if there's any stab at commerciality or, accessibility on Power Windows, it is Emotion Detector, although I don't think they ended up releasing this as a single to my knowledge. I don't think so. So there's that. Mystic Rhythm's a more experimental track. I think it's not imaginative enough for me, even though there's a stab at imagination, but it doesn't go far enough, I might say. Although it's a very, very worthwhile effort. I'm a thumbs up on the track overall, don't get me wrong. I see where they were going, and I just don't think they went far enough, I have to say. I'll be frank. But no, yeah, go and listen to this album, especially with headphones. This is a really exciting and always engaging experience. I mean, if you are a Rush fan, you probably already love this album. Although, if you're one of those Rush fans who have not given Power Windows a time of day, I can't imagine why that would be. If you're an older fan, go back to it. Unless you were really averse to the 80s era, took away the 70s, hey, it is what it is. I wasn't there at the time. But be open-minded. You can lend your ear to Power Windows. And for those who would turn up their nose at Rush, a younger audience or or older audience, particularly a younger audience, you probably enjoy, synthesizer music and, 1980s popular music in general. Give a listen to Power Windows. Like, if you really can't get past Geddy's voice, it is what it is. Although I'm telling you, if you can choose to accept Geddy's voice, Rush's sound, and the potential corniness of the subject matter, I would. I don't think the subject matter's too corny. It's what Neil wanted to write about. He was a very sentimental guy and kind of a, you know, introvert who he sometimes he can be a bit didactic, but I find that's some of the charm of Neil's prose poetry. His metaphors or similes aren't always the most imaginative. They can kind of leave you going, oh, that's a bit obvious, or that's not that clever, but you just have to accept it, right? Sonically, I think Power Windows is one of the most absolutely compelling recordings Rush ever put out. Really excellent stuff to my ears. Power Windows is one of the Rush albums I might find easiest to recommend to a younger person or someone closer to my age who's into, you know, who considers himself something of a music snob. Go. I know you may turn your nose up at the progressive rock of the 1970s and certainly anything they did in the 90s era onward, but go to Power Windows. Give that a listen. You might be surprised. Really. As I said, one of the most interesting albums Rush ever released. I tend to think of the synth era of Rush as one of its most interesting in general. I have to say, I might claim that Moving Pictures through to Power Windows, even Hold Your Fire and Presto, is my favourite era of the band. Certainly Moving Pictures through to Grace Under Pressure / Power Windows is. I love Fly By Night through to Hemispheres quite a bit, although, I just find the Moving Pictures through to Power Windows era to just be... Like, Moving Pictures is a masterpiece, no one denies that. Signals is a huge favourite of mine, actually. It's my favourite Rush album up to that point in time. I'm going to say Grace Under Pressure is my favourite Rush album ever, to be honest. You may remember that used to be the old banner of the AOD channel before the Cybermen invaded. But then Power Windows, I'm going to say my fourth favourite, honestly. Moving Pictures being third favourite, Signals being second favourite, if I didn't make that clear. Not to take anything away from 2112 or Crest of Steel or Fly By Night, I just think the Moving Pictures, Signals, Grace Under Pressure, Power Windows, even to some degree Hold Your Fire and Presto, but not necessarily, are more interesting to me. There's more tracks on them and there's more interesting moments per track as opposed to, look, I love those long suites, but on Farewell to Kings or Hemispheres, although, you know, there's songs... There's 8 songs on Grace Under Pressure when they may be 4 to 5 minutes in length, but they're as interesting as any progressive rock song that Rush put out in the 1970s as far as I'm concerned. I say the track list of Power Windows destroys the track list of Farewell to Kings. I'm not the biggest fan of Close to the Heart, and even if you are, you can't tell me Cinderella Man is remotely listenable. I mean, come on. The Trees and Circumstances are not very interesting 3 to 4 minute songs compared to anything on Power Windows. I think Power Windows just demolishes Permanent Waves, to be perfectly honest. None of the side B tracks on 2112, except for maybe Passage to Bangkok, Something for Nothing I like as well, remotely compete with a Power Windows track. Not even close in my opinion. So there you go, Power Windows. One of the albums which makes you most excited at listening to Rush. One of the albums from Rush that makes you most proud to be a fan of theirs. One of the albums that most makes me feel like I've time travelled back to the 1980s is Power Windows. For better or for worse, I mean. But a really great album as well, that being said. Good stuff from Rush, although that is to be expected, as we know.